In the second part of this course, we will focus on the idea of following behavior, that is, on behavior which is governed by means of rules. A fundamental concept for this domain is the concept of pliance, introduced in psychology to identify a form of behavior whose purpose is to coordinate with a previous verbal stimulus, for instance, a rule that has been given by someone, under the control of some form of reinforcement, which is produced by a social environment around the agent. And this reinforcement, positive or negative, is acting based on the coordination between the rule and the observed behavior. This is about rewards, like, for instance, if you follow the norm, perhaps I will give you something that you like. If you don't follow the norm, then I will give you something that you don't like. The general theory of rational decision making looks at agents as maximizing returns or optimizing the outcome of their actions depending on their preferences. The usual axioms that are associated to rational choice are completeness, so that means that we can rank all actions in terms of preference, transitivity, so if I prefer a certain action to another action and this other action is preferred to yet another action, then the first action is preferred to the third one. And then independence of alternatives. So if I have two actions, one preferred to the other, if I introduce a new action, then I shouldn't change the preferences. We very soon, since ancient Greek philosophy, it was known that if we take a completely rational perspective over decision making, then we end up with the analysis paralysis, the paralysis caused by the need of performing an analysis. Equally hungry and thirsty, at the same distance of water and food, a donkey risks of dying of hunger and of thirst for not taking a decision. I mean, I'm there. So how and what should I choose? In order to decide what is the best, I could end up not doing anything. So this paradox is meant to show the impossibility of decision making using pure reason, especially in the situation that involves two equal choices or almost equal choices. In reality, it is acknowledged that people don't reason in terms of ideal rationality, but in terms of bounded rationality. The evaluation of all conditions and outcomes is impossible. So, for instance, because there may be too many options to evaluate. And information quality, I mean, we are uncertain about what we know about the conditions and the outcomes that may occur. And there is also a volitional contingency problem. The preferences are made up as we go. Sometimes we have arbitrary preferences. We don't know really what we prefer. Sometimes we have preferences that are caused by indifference, and these are hard to remember. Once I decide to take something, the second time I decide to take something else, and at the end I don't care about the two options. So the paradigm of bounded rationality means that we are accepting that the decision making of the agent is limited by the available information, by the cognitive limitations of the mind, and by the finite amount of time that can be dedicated to take a decision. So this is the whereabouts in which Einer presented his own theory. So standard choice theory matches the competence of an agent with the difficulty in selecting most preferred alternatives. It assumes in defining optimality there is no gap between an agent's competence and the difficulty of the decision problem to be solved, the so-called CD gap. The presence of a CD gap will introduce uncertainty in selecting most preferred alternatives, which will tend to produce errors that are unpredictable and erratic. So here we talk of noise as signals that are random and carry no useful information. This provides us actually an empirical observable hypothesis about the effect of irrationality. The additional uncertainty from a larger CD gap will generate more noise in behavior. But now it is clear that the average CD gap of other animals is larger than that of humans. Yet when we observe non-human species, the impression is one of greater rigidity of behavior. And this has been given the description of instinct. Let's consider then three examples of application of this theory. So talking about the CD gap, we can have the competence as variable. That's the case of the animal instinct. So this is a very simple form of life, a worm, that if he sees the light, escapes. His behavior is very simple, and as well the conditions that he checks. But then we can have the difficulty as a variable. For instance, if we consider the chess game, we have many more options at the beginning than at the end. And indeed, we find that at the beginning, in which it's much more complex because there is much more availability of actions, we tend to follow always more or less the same rules. While in the closing games, we end up to have more strategic reasoning. Other situations are in which other agents act as a source of difficulty, when we have centralized planning versus local information. Does it make sense when we need to decide whether to go on the left or the right lane to decide one rule for everybody, or should we decide ad hoc? So each time I need to understand whether you're going left or right. We could say actually that institutions, rules, and self-policing are a way to facilitate the coordination as much as possible. But there are situations in which we prefer to leave autonomy to agents. And that's why we have this true extreme between a complete central planning and market-like mechanism, which are based upon distributed decision-making. Then we have, for instance, Rawls' veil of ignorance, which is a principle, a thought experiment to understand whether a certain law is fair or not. Imagine yourself to be put behind a certain veil, and you cannot know which is the class to which you belong. So this is a test. If you're in a minority group, for instance, then if you do a law that is privileging another group, you will produce a negative result to your own class. If we are applying a rule-following paradigm, like the one described by Heiner, then we know that Donkey in the Buridan's paradox will have a policy for choosing whether he's going through the left or the right. But why this is the best thing to do? Well, simply because all the time that you will spend in order to understand what is the best option is just time that is spent with no reason, which is not going to pay off. On the other hand, the noise hypothesis predicts that each time the Buridan's ass will choose randomly. So, but we have other examples why being predictable is a social value, makes us of value to the others. Trust for love, for friendships, for family. Predictability is also something that we associate to devices. It has connection with the reliability. On the other hand, we know that experimenting costs money in the sense it's a gambling. You never know. So the more you're able to reduce the gambling of reality, the better it is for the agent. So why we suggest to read Heiner in this week? It's because rule-following behavior is actually a very natural behavior. And rule-following is different from rationality. The real world is too messy for rational choice theory, game theory, Bayesian reasoning, etc. And there are experiments in psychology that show, for instance, that adults follow rules that are given much more than children. The central message here is that uncertainty is the core source of predictable behavior, where behaving in traffic corresponds to be predictable for the others. So what we can do, accepting the CD gap analysis, how we can act upon the CD gap? Well, in presence of uncertainty caused by a high CD gap, a decision maker can decrease the difficulty, for instance, by selecting or focusing on relevant information from the environment and dividing the problem into sub-problems to be performed in parallel or in sequence. On the other hand, the decision maker can also increase the competence by proactively finding more information in the environment, so by enriching the flow of information that he is receiving in order to take a decision, or by differentiating the types of responses into normal and abnormal cases. So that means I'm contextualizing in a hierarchical way the way in which I take decision. This is related actually to a cybernetic principle, which has been rephrased by Stafford Beer as only variety can absorb variety. So we have a system that attempts to regulate an environment, and the environment generally is always richer than how much the system can be. So that means that there is an attenuation of all informational flow that is coming from the environment as perceived by the agent. On the other hand, in order to cope with the variety of the environment, we need to have an amplifier of the possible response. And this is the contextualization examples that I gave you before. But things may go wrong, and this happens actually often in organization, because variety of the environment could be further amplified if the organization is not working properly. For instance, because there are dysfunctional modules, how the information is transmitted. On the other hand, the policymaker, the decision maker, may reduce too much the variety of the decision making, so without taking into account of the complexity that should be considered. Stafford Beers in that paper drew a few diagrams about the historical trend. So we started from a pen and pencil type of system to a bureaucratized and organized system in which still everything was made by papers essentially. And then in the 70s, we had the first information system that started entering into administration. But these were just producing an overhead of flow towards the managers. The result was super attenuated with respect to the richness of information that was coming from the environment. And the best system would be one that is able to do both the simplification and the amplification of response. And what is happening today? Who is doing that today? I'll let you reflect a little bit about this topic for the next time.